The brutal rule of medieval siege warfare was clear. Cities that surrendered quickly could expect protection, but those that chose to resist often faced complete destruction. Yet hidden within historical chronicles, buried between stories of chivalry and knightly honor, lies a darker truth. In many cases, the greatest suffering during these conquests fell upon women. When castle gates finally broke and the defensive walls collapsed, the women trapped inside were left to face horrors that many medieval writers struggled to describe in detail. The same knights who recited poems about noble love during the day could transform into ruthless predators after nightfall. Even the church, which preached forgiveness and compassion, often found ways to rationalize the violence that followed. This is not a story of heroic battles or glorious victories. It is the story of what happened after the fighting ended, when the victors turned their attention toward those who had already been defeated. Throughout medieval Europe, siege warfare operated under a harsh but widely understood system. Cities under attack were forced to make a difficult decision: surrender early or risk everything. Historical records suggest that defenders were usually given a short window, often about 3 days, to negotiate terms once a siege had begun. If the gates were opened within that time, the attacking army might allow the garrison to march away with dignity, while civilians could sometimes keep their lives and a portion of their belongings. But if a city resisted and was eventually captured through assault or starvation, any promise of mercy disappeared completely. This was the brutal reality of siege warfare, and the moment when civilian protection collapsed entirely. Siege warfare and the collapse of civilian protection. The rules that governed medieval siege warfare did not appear suddenly. They developed from the military traditions of ancient Rome and slowly evolved through centuries of conflict between Christian and Muslim powers. Over time, these customs became widely accepted across medieval Europe. For commanders, this system had a brutal but practical logic. If a city surrendered quickly, the attackers avoided long and costly battles. Soldiers were spared, resources were saved, and campaigns could move forward faster. The threat of total destruction for those who resisted served as a powerful warning to defenders: surrender early or risk everything. Historical chronicles show that this system often worked exactly as intended. Many cities chose to open their gates before their walls were broken, but when a siege ended with a violent assault, the rules changed completely. Once the walls collapsed and the attacking army stormed the city, the customary law of war allowed soldiers to sack the conquered settlement for a limited period, often around 3 days. During this time, the normal rules of society disappeared. Soldiers who had spent weeks or months risking their lives expected compensation through plunder. Commanders understood that refusing them this reward could lead to anger, rebellion, or even mutiny within the ranks. As a result, cities were stripped of their wealth. Homes were looted, valuables seized, and entire communities left devastated. But the right of sack did not stop with property. It also extended to the people of the defeated city. Women, in particular, were treated as spoils of war within a system that denied them protection once the defenses had fallen. Medieval legal scholars and theologians debated complicated theories about what constituted a just war. Yet these intellectual discussions offered little real protection to those trapped inside conquered cities. Records from administrative documents, court complaints, and scattered chronicles reveal a grim reality. Women faced violence regardless of their social status, their age, or their innocence. When a city fell by force, civilian safety collapsed entirely. Modern laws of war attempt to prevent this breakdown of protection. In medieval siege warfare, however, such suffering was not viewed as an unfortunate accident. Instead, it was an accepted part of the system itself. The experiences of women varied depending on the region and the time period, but certain patterns appear repeatedly in historical sources. In Northern Europe, sieges during the 100 Years' War often resulted in particularly harsh treatment of civilians. When the forces of Edward III captured Caen in 1346, contemporary accounts describe widespread violence throughout the city. Similar scenes occurred across Europe whenever a siege ended through direct assault rather than negotiation. The situation became even more brutal when religious conflict was involved. Warfare connected to the Crusades often removed the few restraints that existed in wars between Christian rulers. When Crusader armies captured cities, religious differences were sometimes used to justify harsh treatment of the population. Women in particular suffered under arguments that labeled them enemies of the faith. One of the most infamous examples occurred during the siege of Jerusalem, 1099. After the city fell, large parts of the Muslim and Jewish population were killed. Some contemporary Muslim accounts describe terrible violence against women and children. Interestingly, many Christian chronicles from the First Crusade avoid detailed descriptions of what happened to female captives. Their silence itself suggests how disturbing those events may have been: punishment and humiliation of women after capture. The fall of a city did not end the suffering of its people. For many women, it marked the beginning of a new and calculated form of humiliation. As soldiers rushed through shattered gates and broken walls, their goals extended beyond treasure and plunder. Victory was also expressed through domination over the defeated population. Medieval sources rarely described these acts directly. When they did acknowledge them, they often framed the violence as divine punishment or as the inevitable consequence of resisting a siege, rather than recognizing it as a crime. The defeated society could no longer defend its own people. Women became symbols through which conquering armies demonstrated their total control. By targeting them, the victors sent a powerful message. Public humiliation served a deeper strategic purpose. When violence against women occurred in front of families or entire communities, it shattered the social order of the conquered city. Medieval culture placed enormous importance on honor, particularly the protection of female relatives by male family members. When women were harmed and men were powerless to stop it, both were humiliated at the same time. Women suffered direct violence, while men experienced the shame of failing to protect those they were expected to defend. This destruction of dignity and identity helped break the spirit of resistance and reinforce the absolute authority of the conquerors. Social class sometimes influenced how women were treated, though the difference was often small. Noble women and the wives of wealthy merchants possessed value as potential ransom targets. Because of this, soldiers sometimes tried to keep them alive and relatively unharmed. Chronicles describe knights claiming specific high-status women as their personal captives. By doing so, they established a kind of ownership that other soldiers were expected to respect. This limited protection did not come from chivalric ideals, but from simple economic calculation. Women of lower status received no such consideration. Peasant women, servants, and those without visible wealth faced immediate violence, with no expectation of ransom or special treatment. Within medieval military culture, such women were often viewed as legitimate spoils of war, treated no differently from captured food supplies or livestock. Legal records from the time show that even when such actions were later brought before courts, punishments were rare and often extremely light. Judges struggled to condemn behavior that military customs had long accepted. Religious institutions offered little reliable protection. In theory, churches and monasteries were supposed to be safe places that armies would respect during war. In reality, these protections frequently collapsed when cities were taken by force. Nuns were especially vulnerable. Their vows of chastity made them powerful symbols, and mistreating them carried a message of total victory over both the city and its faith. Historical sources describe cases where entire convents suffered during the sack of a city, their sacred vows providing no protection against determined attackers. Monasteries that had built reputations for holiness over centuries could lose all protection within a few hours of conquest. The period of sanctioned chaos usually lasted about 3 days. The traditional time allowed for soldiers to sack a captured city. During these days, military discipline often disappeared as troops pursued the rewards they believed they had earned. Commanders who attempted to stop the looting early sometimes risked losing control of their armies entirely. Soldiers who had endured long sieges expected their reward, and denying it could provoke anger or rebellion. Accounts from the era even describe armies ignoring orders from their own leaders. After the forces of William the Conqueror captured Dover in 1066, some sources suggest that soldiers continued their violence despite attempts to restore order. Once the machinery of conquest and revenge began to move, it often proved almost impossible to stop. Ransom, slavery, and forced marriage as spoils of war. For the women who survived the chaos of a city's sack, survival did not necessarily mean safety. Instead, captivity often opened the door to a new and prolonged form of suffering. Systems that allowed captured men, especially nobles, to return home through ransom operated very differently for women. Families attempting to free captured daughters or wives faced difficult decisions. Paying ransom was not only expensive, it also carried a heavy social cost. Medieval society widely assumed that female captives had been abused during captivity. Even if a woman returned physically unharmed, the mere fact of imprisonment could permanently damage her reputation and marriage prospects. Across medieval Europe and the Mediterranean, a large and organized ransom economy developed. Complex systems emerged to determine the value of prisoners and arrange their exchange. Religious organizations sometimes took part in these efforts. Orders such as the Order of the Most Holy Trinity and the Order of the Blessed Virgin Mary of Mercy were founded partly to raise money to rescue Christian captives from Muslim territories. Similar practices existed in reverse during conflicts between Christian and Muslim states. Yet these rescue efforts focused mainly on men, especially soldiers, nobles, or individuals of political value. Women were often treated as a lower priority. Their freedom depended largely on whether their families had enough wealth and whether they were willing to reclaim relatives whose reputations had been socially damaged by captivity. Those whose families could not or would not ransom them frequently entered the expanding medieval slave trade. Powerful maritime states such as Venice and Genoa maintained active slave markets. Captives taken during sieges or naval raids were transported and sold alongside slaves captured through other means. When the forces of Alfonso VII captured Almeria in 1147. Some historical sources report that thousands of Muslim women and children were transported to Genoa and sold. These captives formed part of the payment given to Genoese allies who had supported the naval siege. Such mass enslavement was not unusual during conflicts defined by religious differences. Throughout the medieval period, slave markets operated openly in many major Mediterranean cities. Women sold into slavery faced uncertain futures. Some became household servants, others worked in agriculture or labor. Younger women, or those considered attractive, were sometimes forced into concubinage. Legal systems carefully regulated slave ownership and trade, but these laws rarely protected enslaved people themselves. A woman sold in a slave market had almost no legal recourse against her owner. She could not easily appeal to authorities and had little realistic hope of freedom unless she was voluntarily freed or managed to escape. Another path through which captured women were absorbed into conquering societies was forced marriage. During or after sieges, soldiers or knights sometimes claimed female captives and later formalized the relationship through marriage. In many medieval regions, marriage law required only the agreement of the couple rather than approval from family members. This loophole allowed captors to pressure women into agreeing to marriages that transformed captivity into a legally recognized union. Once married, a woman's independent legal identity often disappeared. She became subject to her husband's authority and lost connection with her birth family and previous community. For conquerors, such marriages served several practical purposes. They provided legal cover for continued control over captive women, secured property rights when women inherited land or wealth, and helped populate newly conquered territories with loyal families. In frontier regions where different religious or ethnic groups competed for control, the forced marriage of captured women could gradually change the demographic balance. Children born from these unions usually belonged to the father's community, slowly reducing the cultural presence of the defeated population. Medieval sources rarely focused on the personal suffering caused by these arrangements. Most chronicles emphasize political events and military achievements rather than individual experiences. Yet scattered pieces of evidence reveal the isolation endured by many captive women. Cut off from their families, forced to live among those who had destroyed their previous lives, and raising children within unfamiliar communities, they often lived in a form of lifelong captivity hidden behind the appearance of normal domestic life. Some medieval writers even portrayed such marriages as religious triumphs, describing them as the conversion of non-Christian women. Through this language, acts of coercion and violence could be reframed as moral victories. The networks that supported slavery and forced marriage eventually became organized systems of trade. Merchants specialized in purchasing and transporting captives across long distances, connecting the supply created by warfare with demand in distant markets. Over time, this process turned human trafficking into a professional enterprise that lasted for centuries. A small number of women in captivity managed to improve their situation. Historical records occasionally mention enslaved women who learned new languages, adopted the religion of their captors, or developed skills that increased their value and influence. However, these cases were rare. For most women captured during sieges, life meant continued subjugation, violence, and often an early death. Some died during the initial sack of the city. Others survived only to spend decades in bondage. The legal and religious systems of medieval Europe offered little real protection. Canon law technically forbade Christians from enslaving fellow Christians, yet in practice, this rule was often ignored. Secular law placed women in a subordinate position and gave them few ways to challenge male authority. Religious arguments about just war and divine punishment frequently served to justify the treatment of conquered populations. Ironically, the institutions that might have limited such brutality often helped legitimize it. Modern historians studying medieval warfare have only recently begun examining the scale of violence directed against women during sieges. Earlier historical writing often ignored or minimized these experiences. Medieval chronicles written by clerics usually focused on battles, kings, and political victories. The suffering of ordinary people, especially women, rarely received detailed attention. But when legal documents and administrative records are studied carefully, they reveal patterns of abuse that sharply contradict the romantic image of medieval chivalry. The gap between medieval Europe's idealized vision of Christian civilization and the harsh reality faced by women in conquered cities remains one of history's most striking contradictions. The women who endured these sieges left almost no direct testimony. Their voices were rarely recorded, their letters seldom preserved, and their stories largely forgotten.